Now, the head of the Wagner mercenary group admits his forces in Bakhmut have been, quote, pretty battered. But Yevgeny Prigozhin insists his mercenaries have practically destroyed the Ukrainian army. Again, those are his claims, and continue, he does, saying they will win the battle for the eastern city. Ukrainian officials, of course, dispute that claim, saying they are the ones that are keeping control of Bakhmut. Now, the U.S. believes there are about 6,000 Wagner mercenaries currently fighting there, and they are suffering serious losses. The top U.S. general saying Ukrainian defense forces are, quote, inflicting a lot of death and destruction on those guys. Ben Wiedemann joins me now from eastern Ukraine. And Ben, really curious to get your insights here. You've been on the ground there for a few days. What more have you learned about the state of play, especially there in Bakhmut? And I know that you've heard from both sides in terms for each giving their position and sometimes putting forward disinformation.
Yes, I mean, seriously, the situation is unclear. Back in January, we were almost every day in Bakhmut, but since the 21st of February, the Ukrainians declared Bakhmut a red zone, so volunteers and journalists simply cannot go there. So I can't tell you firsthand, but what we are hearing is that the Ukrainians are still controlling perhaps 40% of the city, that they have lost some ground over the last few weeks, but the Ukrainians insist that the lines, in their words, have stabilized. Now, what you have ongoing there is really, it's being called a meat grinder, or you could call it a bloodbath. There are heavy casualties on both sides. Now, the ratio of dead Ukrainians to dead Russians, it's not clear. Some put it as much as 5 dead Russians for every 1 dead Ukrainian. Others say it's more like 1 dead Russian, or rather 2 dead Russians for 1 Ukrainian. So the battle is intense. And certainly what we've seen is that there are many Ukrainian forces deployed on the outskirts of Bakhmut. They've dug defensive positions. There's lots of armor in the area. So in the event the Ukrainians can no longer hold Bakhmut, they hold the high ground to the west of the city, and they certainly would be able to stop a Russian advance there. It's been really a battle of quantity versus quality. The Russians obviously have a huge numerical advantage, and certainly in terms of weaponry, their weaponry may be antiquated, but they have a lot of ammunition, which we've heard from Ukrainian officials that they don't seem to be suffering, the Russians that is, from a shortage of artillery shells. But certainly the situation is more or less stalemated, but at a high price to both sides, Paula.
To both sides, and we have been hearing that quite clearly. We just went over what U.S. officials had said. I wonder what you make of the Wagner leader, Prigozhin. He admitted, okay, that they are battered. But what about his claims that he's inflicting great pain on Ukraine, and the fact that he continually gives it, literally gives it, to the Russian Defense Ministry about what he needs on the ground and what he hasn't gotten on the ground?
Well, we've heard him complain quite publicly, time and time again, about not receiving adequate support from the Russian Defense Ministry and specifically the Russian army. He's got a feud with those people. And at the end of the day, the force that has the resources is the Russian army. And all reports indicate that the Wagner group has lost thousands of its fighters. Now, I suggest we put that in quotation marks. Many of them are simply convicts with very little in the way of training. And we've spoken to Ukrainian soldiers when I was here last January, who said that the Russians use a very specific tactic. They will send waves of this basically cannon fodder, convicts and others, poorly trained people forward to allow for the Ukrainians to open fire. They expose their firing positions, and then better trained, better equipped Russian troops will then focus their fire on the Ukrainians. So it comes at a very high price to the Wagner group, but it's also inflicting a high cost on the Ukrainians. But Prigozhin, it's hard to say how much longer he can carry on with this feud with the Russian military hierarchy, and how much longer his military force can go on taking these high losses. Paula?
Yeah, especially what may be to come in terms of a change to that stalemate as spring has now sprung in Ukraine. Ben Wiedemann for us on the Eastern Front Lines there. Appreciate it.